Rick and I just moved into our new house. Spacious, bright, surrounded by trees and greenery. When we first saw it, I was certain this place would become our perfect nest. A quiet suburb, not too far from the city, but isolated enough for us to enjoy peace and seclusion. I imagined us having dinner on the terrace, watching sunsets, with every corner of the house filled with warmth and coziness. It was supposed to be the start of something new, something happy. But reality turned out differently. Rick, as always, is absorbed in his work. His phone rings endlessly. His schedule is filled with shifts and emergency calls. He's a successful doctor, and I'm proud of him. But sometimes it feels like his work is taking not just all his time, but us as well. I am left alone in this enormous house, which was meant to be a symbol of our new chapter. The sound of my footsteps echoes through the empty rooms, and the cold light from the windows only intensifies the feeling of emptiness. I want to find something here, something that will bring back my joy. I thought this move would bring us closer, that in this new house we would have the opportunity to build a family, raise children, and spend more time together. But so far, it all feels like an illusion. The house that was supposed to be the beginning of our happiness has become a place of loneliness. I often find myself waiting for Rick, listening to the ticking of the clock for hours. His rare calls from the hospital to tell me he'll be late only deepen this feeling. He promises that things will change, that one day work will stop consuming so much time. But I'm not sure how long I can keep waiting. Silence has already settled in our home. I don't know how to chase it away. When Henry moved in with us, it was like a sudden shift in the rhythm of life. He had just lost his wife, and Rick offered him a place to stay with us, so he wouldn't have to be alone in a house full of memories. I immediately agreed. After all, Henry had always been a figure of strength and confidence to me. He was the kind of man who commanded attention with his charisma and calm presence. I always thought he had everything under control. But his arrival brought a different energy into the house. Henry introduced something new. Not necessarily good or bad, just different. We started talking more. Rick, as usual, was constantly at work, and I found myself spending my days with Henry. We would sit in the kitchen, drink coffee, and talk about life, about the past, and what the future might hold. I tried to be attentive, to understand his grief after the loss, but soon I realized our conversations were becoming more personal. Something had shifted in our interactions. What had once been simple chats now carried a new undertone. I started noticing how he looked at me, and how that gaze made me feel different. I couldn't quite pinpoint where it came from, but his presence began to evoke a strange, unsettling yet magnetic feeling within me. Our conversations gained a new depth. We no longer spoke just about his wife or Rick's work, but about life, about things that mattered to both of us. It wasn't full of confessions, but each new dialogue added an invisible tension. I felt there was something more hanging between us than just friendly exchanges. I didn't know how to interpret it, but I couldn't deny that it was pulling me in. Sometimes I caught myself looking forward to his presence, anticipating our talks. It was strange, but the feeling grew like a snowball, and with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the inner conflict building within me. When Rick left for another night shift, the house fell into silence. I had already grown used to these endless nights without him, but with Henry's arrival, things felt different. He filled that empty space with his presence. In those moments, it was just the two of us, sitting in the kitchen, talking. It seemed like time stopped during those evenings, leaving only the two of us, as if no one else existed in our little world. We talked about many things, about his wife, about how hard it was for him to lose her, about how I was coping with the loneliness while Rick was always at work. These conversations became a kind of comfort for both of us. We shared our fears, our emotions, and slowly it brought us closer. There was an invisible connection between us, something I couldn't put into words but felt deeply within me. One evening, as our conversation slowly faded, Henry accidentally touched my hand. It was a small, almost fleeting gesture, but it was like a jolt of electricity. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. He pulled his hand away as quickly as he had touched me. But that brief contact was enough to ignite something strange and unknown within me. I couldn't quite understand what I was feeling, but it was impossible to ignore the impact of that touch. When it was time to say goodnight, we stood up from the table. Henry came over to me and, as usual, gave me a hug. But this time the hug was different. It lasted a little longer than usual, a little tighter than it should have been. I felt his warmth, his strength, and something inside me responded. That embrace stirred something deep within me. My head spun with emotion, and for a moment I got lost in his touch. When he finally let go, I tried to hide my confusion, but something had changed inside me. It wasn't just a physical gesture, it was something more, something I couldn't explain. I went upstairs to my bedroom, and as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about that touch, about that hug. I couldn't shake the thoughts from my mind. Everything I felt was new and frightening, yet at the same time, inevitable. That evening, Rick was called away for an emergency surgery again. I had grown accustomed to his sudden departures, but each time something inside me tightened as he left, leaving me alone. Noticing my mood, Henry suggested something to distract me. "Why don't you come down to the wine cellar with me?" he said with a soft smile. "I think we could both use a glass of wine." I agreed, and together we descended into the cool cellar beneath the house, where rows of old bottles stood neatly on the shelves. The dark walls and dim lighting created an almost intimate atmosphere. Henry expertly opened one of the bottles, and we sat down in the old leather chairs tucked away in the corner. The wine was rich and robust, perfect for a long conversation. At first, we talked about harmless things, the house, plans for the future. But gradually, our conversation shifted to something more personal. Henry began talking about his wife, about how her death had changed his life. "It's like living with an emptiness inside," he said quietly without looking at me. "She was always there, and now I don't know what to do." I listened intently, feeling his pain. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would ease his suffering, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a tension hanging in the air. Something subtle had changed in his voice, in his gaze. I was acutely aware of his presence beside me more than ever before. Henry looked up and met my eyes. His gaze was deep, filled with an unspoken sorrow. In that moment, I realized I was drawn to him. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they only grew stronger. My breath became shallow, and I struggled to maintain composure, even as a whirlwind of emotions raged inside me. Finally, Henry sighed and stood up. "Maybe it's time we head back upstairs," he said, avoiding my gaze. We both knew that something had left an indelible mark on our relationship that evening, but neither of us dared to take the next step. We quietly made our way out of the cellar, and I felt that something significant had shifted between us. The tension lingered in the air, but no one was brave enough to break it. Night had enveloped the garden in soft darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers. Henry and I sat in the gazebo, quietly talking and sipping wine. Rick was on another night shift, and the world felt distant, as if all the problems and concerns were left outside our small haven. The wine warmed my veins, and the atmosphere of the moonlit garden created an almost magical feeling. "You know," Henry said unexpectedly, "this place seems perfect for a slow dance." He looked at me with a slight smile, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I couldn't turn down his offer, even if I had wanted to. I nodded, smiling in return. Henry stood up, walked over to me, and extended his hand. I placed mine in his, and he gently led me to the center of the gazebo. There was no music, but we didn't need it. We began to dance in silence, surrounded only by the whisper of the wind and the soft rustle of the leaves. He wrapped his arms around my waist, and I felt his strong hands envelop me with warmth. With every step, we drew closer and closer. The dance was slow, calm, but there was something more between us than just the rhythm of our movements. It was a tension, growing with each passing moment. Henry gradually pulled me tighter against him, his hands sliding along my back, and I felt my own arms wrap around his shoulders. My mind was screaming that this was wrong, but my body seemed to act on its own. At one point, our faces were so close that I could hear his breath. Our eyes met, and it was like lightning piercing through the darkness. Henry suddenly leaned forward and kissed me. It was unexpected, but I couldn't push him away. In that moment, time seemed to stop. His lips softly touched mine, and that kiss filled everything around us, leaving nothing else in the world. I was overwhelmed by shock, but at the same time a surge of unfamiliar, intense emotions. I couldn't figure out exactly what I was feeling: fear, excitement, or something deeper. But one thing was certain: I couldn't control these feelings. My head spun and my heart raced as if it were ready to burst out of my chest. When Henry pulled away, he looked at me carefully, as if trying to read my reaction. But I remained silent. My mind was torn between guilt and the undeniable truth. I was drawn to him. That kiss had changed everything. After that kiss, everything changed. I couldn't stop thinking about it: how gently Henry had touched me, how warm his lips felt against mine. Every time I replayed that moment in my mind, guilt would wash over me. But along with it came another feeling, something I couldn't control, something I couldn't ignore. My attraction to Henry was growing stronger, and that pull terrified me. I tried to avoid him. As soon as I heard Henry downstairs, I stayed in my room, using any excuse to keep my distance. I spent more time alone, reading or pretending to be busy, until he finally left the house for his errands. When I heard the front door close behind him, I would exhale in relief, though the feeling never lasted long. Even when I managed to avoid his physical presence, his image haunted me. I saw him in every corner of the house, in every little thing he had touched. It became unbearable. Every time our eyes did meet, I could feel the silent tension hanging between us. It was as if our eyes spoke more than words ever could. There was an invisible thread connecting us, and with each glance, that thread seemed to tighten. One day, as I walked down the hallway, our hands brushed against each other. It was just a light touch, but it was enough to awaken all the feelings I had been trying to suppress. His fingers lingered on mine for a second longer than necessary, and I felt that familiar flame ignite inside me. I quickly pulled my hand away and hurried off, but it didn't stop the overwhelming emotions from flooding back. I was being torn apart. On one hand, I was Rick's wife. I was supposed to be loyal, to be there for him, especially when he was almost never home. But on the other hand, I could no longer ignore what I felt for Henry. It was wrong, I knew that. But every look, every touch, even the briefest ones, convinced me that our connection had gone beyond simple interaction. It had become something more than just a fleeting weakness. I tried to fight it, but with each passing day, that fight became harder. My heart and mind were at war, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep myself in check. With each passing day, the situation became more complicated. Henry never missed a chance to talk to me. He found random excuses to be near, and our conversations inevitably grew more personal. What started as casual remarks turned into increasingly open discussions. We spoke about things I could never share with anyone else, and this closeness frightened me. I tried to keep my distance, but every time Henry came closer, that familiar spark ignited within me. It was too easy to talk to him, too easy. Our dialogues began to feel like a game, where one word led to another, and we both knew we couldn't stop the growing tension. Henry spoke about his loss, how much he missed his wife. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and each time he mentioned her name, I could feel that he was trying to fill the void she had left. I understood his pain, but there was something in his words that felt too intimate. We were no longer just two people sharing space. We were becoming something more than we could allow ourselves to be. I fought with myself, convinced that this was all wrong, but as soon as Rick left for work, I felt a sense of relief. My heart would race the moment I realized I'd be alone with Henry. It was like an invisible release from the duties and norms that weighed on me every day. I knew this feeling was wrong, but I couldn't shake it. Evenings became moments of quiet yet intense anticipation. I could feel his eyes on me, and it stirred something deep inside. We talked less and less about Rick, about work, about the everyday. Instead, our conversations delved into the depths of our thoughts, our fears and desires we were too afraid to voice. Every glance, every word spoken softly and thoughtfully, seemed like hints that neither of us dared to understand. Inside, I was at war, torn between my duty as a wife and these new feelings I could no longer ignore. And with each passing day, I knew that this inner struggle would only grow stronger. The evening was warm, and Henry suggested we all take a walk through the garden. It was unexpected, but felt natural. Rick had just come home from work, tired but in a good mood. We strolled slowly among the shrubs and trees, lost in quiet conversation. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and flowers, making the walk even more pleasant. Eventually, we reached a bench tucked away in a corner of the garden, a place we rarely visited. Henry sat down first, and Rick and I followed suit. Around us, the silence of the night enveloped us, with only the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. We sat there, enjoying the peace as time seemed to stand still. "You know," Rick began, wrapping his arm around my shoulders, "it's just so great. To sit here with my beloved wife and my dad in the garden. I don't need anything else." He said it with such ease and sincerity that I felt something tighten inside me. A wave of shame washed over me. Every word Rick spoke echoed within me like a reminder of my betrayal. I could feel his warmth next to me and realized that despite his constant absences, he genuinely loved me and saw me as his anchor. I tried to smile, but my mind was racing. Meanwhile, Henry, not showing any emotion, supported the conversation, agreeing with Rick. "You're right, Rick. These are the moments that really matter. We often forget that." There was a slight hint of irony in his voice, but his face remained completely calm. He spoke as if nothing had happened, as if there had been no kiss between us, no tension, no silent game. And I sat there feeling my conscience gnawing at me from the inside. Guilt wouldn't let me rest. Everything I had done over the past few weeks flashed before my eyes, and every touch, every glance from Henry now felt like betrayal. I tried to push those thoughts away, but they only grew louder. Sitting beside me was my husband, the man who believed in me, who trusted me, and I had broken that trust. Rick kept talking about how wonderful it was to sit together as a family, and every time he said those words, it felt like they were piercing straight through me. I kept my head down, staring at the ground, avoiding eye contact with Henry to keep from giving myself away. This night in the garden, which should have been a moment of family unity, had become an ordeal for me. Shame and guilt filled every part of me, and I could no longer hide from my own thoughts. The past few days felt like they were wrapped in a thick fog. I was sinking deeper into my thoughts, trying to find a way out of this maze of emotions. Everything I had done before seemed so simple and clear, but now every step I took was accompanied by doubt. I knew I had gone too far, and there was no way back. Every morning, waking up next to Rick, I looked at him, and a wave of guilt washed over me. I still loved him. That was undeniable. He was the person with whom I shared my dreams, my plans for the future. But as soon as I was left alone, Henry once again filled all my thoughts. This attraction had become unbearable, like a magnet I couldn't turn away from. I tried to convince myself that I could turn back, that I could become the woman I once was. A faithful wife, a devoted spouse. But every time I looked into Henry's eyes, I realized that was no longer possible. Something had changed deep inside me, and I could no longer live as I had before. These conflicting feelings were tearing me apart. I hated myself for betraying Rick, for allowing my feelings for his father to go this far. But at the same time, I felt an overwhelming desire to be near Henry. Every look, every touch reminded me that I was no longer in control of myself. I was afraid to admit it, afraid to admit that my life would never be the same again, that I couldn't just go back to the way things were before that kiss. I wanted to hide, to run away from this agonizing choice, but that was impossible. Every day, I was being pulled deeper into this whirlwind of emotions. Rick remained my anchor, a symbol of stability and love, but Henry had become the one who awakened feelings in me I hadn't felt in years. I could no longer pretend that there was nothing between us. It was obvious. I was standing on the edge, torn between two men, and the feeling was becoming unbearable. Rick left late in the evening for an emergency call, leaving me alone in our big, quiet house. I lay in bed, unsuccessfully trying to sleep, but thoughts of Henry wouldn't let me rest. Everything that had happened between us, everything I felt, filled every corner of my mind. I couldn't get rid of these thoughts, even if I wanted to. All day, my feelings for Henry had only intensified, and the more I tried to resist, the stronger this desire consumed me. Some time passed, and the silence of the room was broken by a soft knock at the door. My heart began to race when I heard footsteps outside. Henry. He quietly opened the door and peeked into the room, seeing that I was still awake. "I can't sleep," he said quietly, stepping into the room and approaching the bed. "Maybe we could watch a movie? It seems like you're not sleeping either." His words seemed simple and innocent, but the tension between us spoke volumes. I nodded, knowing I couldn't refuse. Inside, excitement swelled, and I felt that this night would change everything. Henry sat at the edge of the bed and I sat up beside him. We turned on the TV, but the movie didn't matter. Our minds were far from the screen. We sat close to each other, and the air around us felt charged. The conversation was quiet, almost imperceptible, but the tension between us grew with each word. Henry suddenly reached out and lightly touched my hand. The touch was so simple, yet everything inside me turned upside down. I felt his warmth, his presence, and that touch made me forget everything else. We continued sitting next to each other, but that light contact turned into something more. His hand slid across my skin, and my heart beat faster. I looked at him, our eyes met, and everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to process what would happen next. Henry leaned in, and the next moment his lips were on mine. The kiss was full of passion, the kind we had held back for so long. I responded to the kiss, unable to resist what I was feeling. His hands moved over my body, exploring every curve, and I was completely lost in the sensation, forgetting everything around me. My head spun, my breathing became heavier, and every moment felt endless. But suddenly, the moment was interrupted by the sharp sound of my phone ringing. I froze, jolted back to reality. It was Rick. My mind snapped back, and I pulled away from Henry's embrace. Realizing what was happening, I reached for the phone, still trying to hide the embarrassment and excitement that surged through me. "Hello," I said, pressing the phone to my ear, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Are you already asleep?" Rick asked, and there was a note of suspicion in his voice. I could hear the faint sounds of the hospital corridor in the background, reminding me of how far away he was, yet how close he was to the truth. "Yes," I replied, trying to speak steadily. "I was just about to go to bed." But my voice betrayed me. I could feel my breathing was too heavy, too fast. I saw Henry watching me, and it only heightened the tension. Rick heard my breathing, and more doubt crept into his voice. "Are you sure?" he asked again, now with more obvious suspicion. My heart pounded wildly, and I barely managed to keep myself from revealing the truth. I repeated that I was tired and about to sleep, hoping he wouldn't notice my anxiety. But his suspicions were already growing. He didn't say anything more, and the call ended. But inside, something had broken. I didn't know that Rick had already started suspecting something. When I put the phone down, the silence of the room returned. I felt my heart still racing. But instead of stopping, I turned back to Henry. My body responded to his closeness once again. Everything that had just happened no longer mattered. I was once again lost in the moment, in his touches and kisses. We returned to our passion, forgetting everything. Rick came home much earlier than I expected. I didn't know the emergency call had been a false alarm, and he had decided to return. The house was completely silent, with the light from the bedroom being the only warmth in that moment. I was consumed by the moment with Henry, lost in everything. His touch, his closeness. It overwhelmed me completely. I didn't hear Rick come in or walk up the stairs. At that moment, reality seemed distant, and all that mattered was our feelings and the pull between us. I didn't immediately realize he was standing in the doorway. My eyes were closed, and for a brief second I was lost in what I felt. But when I finally opened my eyes, my heart stopped. Rick was standing there, frozen in the doorway, his face twisted with shock and anger. At first I couldn't believe what I was seeing, as if it were a nightmare I would soon wake up from. But it was real. "Rick," I whispered, my voice quiet, almost a breath, but it didn't matter. Everything was already clear, and words were unnecessary. I saw his eyes, full of pain. I had never seen such hatred in them before. How did he find out? How did this happen? How had we come to this? In that moment, all my excuses and attempts to explain seemed pointless. Everything had crumbled in a single instant, and I knew there was no going back. Henry also stepped back, and I could feel the tension in the room shift. He didn't say anything, but his face said everything. Whatever was between us was now destroyed. But the most devastating part was that this wasn't just about us. It had destroyed everything with Rick, too. Rick stood there unmoving, as if the world around him had collapsed. His breath was ragged, his hands clenched into fists, but he couldn't find the words. I could see the storm brewing inside him, but he couldn't speak his anger aloud. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice filled with pain and fury. Those words pierced me deeply. I couldn't answer. Any words I could have said wouldn't have mattered. Everything I had hidden, everything I had felt was now laid bare before him. I had betrayed him, betrayed us, and there was no turning back. Rick didn't say a word. The silence hanging in the air felt deafening. His face remained unreadable, but in his gaze, I saw everything I had feared. Anger, betrayal, contempt. He looked at Henry, his eyes narrowing with hatred, and for a moment it seemed like he was barely restraining himself from striking him. Instead, Rick spat on the floor. That single gesture was like a final blow, speaking louder than any words could. I knew in that moment that it was over. There would be no explanations, no apologies. Everything that Henry and I had destroyed with this act now lay before us, and Rick left no room for forgiveness. His contempt was too great to express with words. He turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him, and silence once again filled the room. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to even breathe, stunned by the quiet that followed. Henry said nothing either. The air was thick with a sense of hopelessness that seemed impossible to escape. The world I once knew had collapsed in a single moment. I realized there was no way back. There was no hope of restoring what had once been. Everything was destroyed. My relationship with Rick, the life I had built so carefully. But mixed with the guilt inside me were darker feelings. The fire that Henry had ignited within me hadn't died. Even now, standing on the edge of my shattered life, I couldn't entirely deny my feelings for him. But it brought me no comfort. Everything I had, everything I wanted to hold on to, was now in ruins. I knew I had made a terrible mistake, but I also knew that even if I could turn back time deep down, my feelings wouldn't have changed. That realization tore me apart. Guilt and desire, pain and passion twisted inside me, and I didn't know how to live with these emotions. The silence in the house after Rick's departure became unbearable. The world that once felt so secure now seemed empty and broken. I could no longer pretend that things could be fixed. My marriage was dead, and with it, a part of me had died too. All that remained was this emptiness, this despair, and I was completely alone in this ruined world. A few days had passed since Rick left. The house was filled with a silence I couldn't escape. It felt like the very air around me had thickened, pressing down on me, reminding me constantly that everything was destroyed. Rick hadn't tried to contact me, nor did he answer any of my calls or messages, but I knew it was only a matter of time, and that time came. The divorce papers arrived in the morning. I held them in my hands, feeling something break inside me. There were no explanations, no requests, no attempts to understand what had happened. It was a cold statement. He wanted a divorce. No conversations, no attempts to reconcile or understand. Rick didn't want to hear from me or from Henry. To him, our betrayal was final and beyond forgiveness. I understood him. There were no excuses for what Henry and I had done. I couldn't ask for forgiveness. Everything I had was now destroyed. Rick was right. How could a family be rebuilt when trust had been so brutally shattered? Our family no longer existed. Henry, too, realized that his actions had not only destroyed my life, but also his relationship with his son. After that night, he left as well, and I didn't know if he would ever return. The man who had once been a symbol of strength and certainty for me now seemed just as broken as everything around us. His bond with Rick, which had once been so strong, was now severed. Their relationship could never survive what had happened. Every corner of this house now reminded me of what had been lost. The rooms that had once been filled with laughter, joy, and life now felt dark and empty. I was left alone in this house, full of memories that no longer brought comfort. Instead, they only served as reminders of what I had lost. The family I had spent so long building was destroyed, and it was all because of my own betrayal. I wandered through the empty rooms, unsure of how to move forward. I had destroyed everything I had. My family, my marriage, my relationship with Rick. All of it had vanished in a single moment. In my heart, there was only emptiness, an emptiness that refused to leave me in peace. I knew I would have to start over, but I had no idea where to begin. Everything I had loved was now in ruins. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the house as I closed the door behind me for the last time. This house, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt foreign and distant. Everything that had connected me to this place was shattered, and I realized that I no longer belonged here. I was leaving behind everything, memories, dreams, and even what had once been my life. With each step, I felt the weight of my decisions grow heavier. Henry had vanished from my life as suddenly as he had entered it. After that evening, he never returned, and I didn't even know where he was. Perhaps, like me, he was trying to escape the past, to run from what we had done. But it didn't matter anymore. Our paths had diverged, and I knew I would never see him again. The past now seemed distant, unreachable, as if it belonged to another woman, not me. I had tried to hold on to it, but with each passing day I realized it was beyond my grasp. Everything I once held dear was lost. I had destroyed my family, lost Rick's love, and now Henry was gone too. I was alone, facing an uncertain future. The future felt dark, filled with uncertainty and fear. I couldn't go back to the life I once knew, but I didn't know how to start a new one. All that remained were the ruins of what I had once built. I would have to gather these pieces and try to create something new. But how? How could I live with the weight of guilt and the missed opportunities? I sat in the car, ready to leave, but inside I was torn apart by a sense of emptiness. There was no clear path ahead, only a vague understanding that I had to move forward. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here. My past no longer existed, and now I had to find a way to live in a future I didn't yet understand. The road ahead was empty, much like my thoughts. I turned on the engine and slowly drove away, leaving the house behind. This was the end of the life I had known, and the beginning of something new, though I couldn't yet grasp what this new journey would be. But I knew I had no other choice. I had to move forward, even if I didn't know how.